Before we get into this story, I want to ask you something. If you found out that the person sleeping beside you for 6 years had never actually seen you, not really, what would you do? Would you scream? Would you cry? Would you make them feel every ounce of what they put you through? Or would you just walk out the door quietly and let the silence say everything? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from tonight. Whether you're in Vancouver wrapping up a long week, in Toronto, watching the snow come down, or somewhere in the Maritimes with a cup of tea going cold on the counter. I want to know you're out there, and if this is your first time here, welcome to Velvet Confessions. Hit subscribe. We tell the kind of stories that don't make the news, but live in the bones of people who've been through them. Now, let me tell you about Cecily Hargrove, the night everything ended. It was raining in Halifax. Not the dramatic, cinematic kind of rain, not the kind that sweeps in off the Atlantic and rattles the old windows of a century home. It was the other kind, the Halifax kind, the slow, gray, relentless drizzle that doesn't announce itself, that simply settles over the city like a damp cloth and refuses to leave. The kind of weather that makes everything feel slightly more permanent than it actually is. Cecily Hargrove stood at the top of the stone steps outside the Meridian Club, on Barrington Street, her coat still buttoned, her clutch held in both hands in front of her, and she did not move. Inside, behind the tall frosted glass doors, the annual fundraising dinner for the Atlantic Children's Foundation was in full swing. She could hear the murmur of it. The clink of glasses, the low wave of conversation, the practiced laughter of people who had been taught to laugh at the right moments. She had attended this dinner every year for 6 years. She had organized the silent auction 3 times. She had personally called in favors from 11 corporate sponsors. And once, on a Tuesday afternoon, she would never forget, convinced a notoriously difficult real estate developer to write a check for $40,000, simply by being the kind of woman who knew which questions to ask and when to stop talking. She was good at this. She had always been good at this, and tonight she had arrived to find her husband seated at table 7 with a woman named Rochelle Vane, not seated beside her, not in the polite, incidental way that strangers end up adjacent at charity events, seated with her in the particular way that people sit together when they have already said each other's names. In the dark, his hand resting on the back of her chair, her head tilted toward him at an angle that took years to cultivate. Cecily had stood in the doorway for exactly 4 seconds. Then she had turned around, walked back through the lobby, nodded to the coat check attendant, whose name she knew was Patrick, pushed open the heavy front door, and stood at the top of the steps in the rain. She did not cry. She had not cried in a very long time, actually. Not since her mother's funeral 3 years ago, on a morning that had also been gray, also been wet, also been the kind of day that made everything feel slightly more permanent than it should. She had cried then, properly, the way you cry when the grief is so large it has nowhere to go but out, and sometime after that, something in her had gone very still. Not broken, not numb, just still. She stood on those steps for a long moment, looking out at the wet street, the headlights smearing yellow across the pavement, a cab idling at the corner. She thought, with a clarity that surprised her, this is the part where I'm supposed to go back in. She was supposed to walk back into that room, find her table, sit down next to her husband, Rowan Hargrove, and perform the remainder of the evening with the same grace she had performed every other evening for the past 6 years. She was supposed to make conversation with the people around her, eat whatever was being served, clap at the right moments during the remarks from the foundation chair. She was supposed to be the version of herself that Rowan had always found most useful, composed, capable, invisible in her competence. She took one step down, then another. By the time she reached the bottom of the steps, she had already decided. She was going home to pack a bag. Rowan Hargrove was 44 years old, and he had been, for most of his adult life, the kind of man who moved through rooms the way a current moves through water. Without effort, bending everything around him slightly, without ever appearing to try. He was the second-generation owner of Hargrove Maritime Holdings, a mid-sized shipping and logistics company headquartered in Halifax with contracts along the entire eastern seaboard. His father had built it from a single brokerage office on Water Street. Rowan had tripled it. He was not a cruel man precisely. He was something more specific than cruel, and, in many ways, more difficult to name. He was a man who had never been asked to be more than what he was, and so he never had been. He looked at Cecily and saw a woman who ran his household, organized his social obligations, remembered the names of his clients' children, and never complained. He mistook her silence for contentment. He mistook her competence for simplicity. He had met Rochelle Vane at a conference in Montreal 8 months ago. He had told himself, in the way that people tell themselves things they do not entirely believe, that it was not serious, that it was the kind of distraction that men in his position sometimes had, that Cecily would never find out, and that, even if she did, she would understand that these things happened, and that it did not mean anything about their marriage or about her. He had been so certain of this that he had brought Rochelle to the Atlantic Children's Foundation dinner. He had told himself Cecily might not come. She had mentioned something about a scheduling conflict. He had half believed it, or told himself he had. He had reserved a table and seated Rochelle at it, and had been in the middle of explaining something about a new port contract in St. John, when he looked up and saw the back of a woman in a dark green coat walking out of the lobby. He recognized the coat before he recognized anything else. He excused himself from the table. By the time he reached the lobby, the front doors were swinging closed. By the time he pushed through them and stepped out onto the steps, the rain was still falling and Cecily was gone. He stood there for a moment with his hands in his pockets. Then he went back inside. He told himself she had probably gone home early. He told himself he would call her on the drive back. He told himself she would be sitting in the kitchen when he arrived with a glass of water, and that expression she had, sometimes, the quiet one, the one he had never learned to read properly, and that they would talk, and it would be fine. He told himself a great many things on the 40-minute drive back to their house in the South End. The house was dark when he arrived. Not the darkness of someone gone to bed early. The specific darkness of a house that has been properly emptied. He found her note on the kitchen island. It was handwritten on the back of an envelope. The same cream-colored stationery she used for thank you cards. It said, "I think we've both known for a long time. I'm not angry. Don't look for me until you've been honest with yourself about what you were hoping I would be." See. He read it twice. Then he poured himself a glass of water and stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the dark backyard and thought, for the first time in a very long time, that he might not understand anything as well as he had believed. What Rowan did not know, what he had never bothered to know, because knowing things about Cecily had never seemed necessary, was that his wife had been quietly building something for the past 4 years. It had started, the way most important things start, with grief. When Cecily's mother, Judith Hargrove née Folds, died in the autumn 3 years ago, she left behind a house in Lunenburg, a modest collection of antique maps that Cecily had grown up loving, and a solicitor named Bernard who had been trying, with patient persistence, to reach Cecily for the better part of a year before that. Judith had not been wealthy in any obvious sense. She had been a high school geography teacher for 30 years and had lived, as far as Cecily knew, on a teacher's pension and the quiet pleasures of a woman who knew what mattered to her. What Cecily had not known was that Judith's own mother, Cecily's grandmother, a woman named Alvina Folds, who had died before Cecily was born, had owned a significant parcel of land in what was then rural Nova Scotia, which had been sold in the 1970s to a property development company, the proceeds of which had been placed into a trust administered by a Halifax law firm. The trust had compounded largely unexamined for 50 years. By the time Bernard finally sat across from Cecily in his cluttered office on Spring Garden Road and opened the relevant folder, it had grown to something that made her go very quiet, in a way that was different from her usual quiet. She did not tell Rowan. She had sat with that decision for 3 days. She had turned it over, examined it, tried to find the version of herself that would simply go home and say, "You won't believe what Mum left me." She had looked for that version of herself and not found her. What she found instead was a clear-eyed recognition that she had been living for 6 years in a marriage where she was the person who made everything function and the last person whose interior life was ever considered. She thought, if I tell him, he will find a way to make this about what it means for us, for the company, for the next 5-year plan. He will fold this into the life I already have, and the life I already have is not the life I want. She left the money where it was. She hired a financial advisor named Quincy Shaw, a quietly brilliant woman she had been referred to through a friend at the foundation, and she started educating herself. Not quickly, not dramatically. The way you learn something when you're learning it for yourself, on your own time, in the margins of a life that is already full. She read. She asked questions. She made careful decisions with the portions of the trust that were accessible to her, and she left the larger portions alone until she understood them well enough to act. She also, quietly, left her job. This was perhaps the detail that Rowan had found least notable at the time, which was itself telling. Cecily had worked, when they first met, as a program coordinator for a nonprofit that supported adult literacy. She had been good at it, genuinely good, the kind of good that people remember in meetings years later. And she had left it when they married because Rowan's schedule was complicated, and his household was complicated, and someone needed to be the axis around which the rest of it turned. She had told herself it was temporary. She had told herself many things. 4 years ago, she had quietly resumed. Not the same job, something different. She had taken on a contract role with a small community development organization in Dartmouth that was working on affordable housing initiatives, and she had been so effective within the first 6 months that they had asked her to lead the development side of the organization. She had said yes. She had built it, methodically and without fanfare, into something that was beginning to attract national attention. She had not hidden this from Rowan. She had simply mentioned it in the way she mentioned most things about her own life. Briefly, in passing, in the moments between his sentences, and he had responded, in the way he responded to most things about her life, with a kind of absent nod that meant he had heard the words and processed none of them. She had stopped correcting this a long time ago. The night she left the Meridian Club, Cecily drove to her friend Marguerite's house in Dartmouth. Marguerite Osei had been her closest friend since university, a woman with the particular quality of knowing when to ask questions and when to simply open the door and put the kettle on. She did the latter. Cecily sat at her kitchen table and held a mug of tea she didn't drink, and the two of them talked until 2 in the morning, not about Rochelle Vane, not about Rowan, but about what Cecily wanted the next chapter to look like. She already knew most of it. She had been thinking about it for 4 years. The calls started 2 days later. Rowan called 6 times on the first day. He left 3 voicemails, the first of which was careful, the second of which was slightly less careful, and the third of which had a quality she recognized, a clipped, controlled frustration that meant he was confused about why the situation had not resolved itself. He was not accustomed to things not resolving themselves when he wanted them to. She let the calls go to voicemail. She texted him the name of her solicitor. He called her solicitor, who informed him that Steve was not seeking anything from the marriage, beyond what was legally straightforward. There was a prenuptial agreement, which they had signed 6 years ago in the formal, efficient way that people who are in love sometimes sign legal documents quickly, without reading them carefully enough. The agreement had been drafted as it happened by the same law firm that administered the Folds family trust, and the solicitor who had drafted it had been thorough in a way that Rowan's own lawyer, when he eventually reviewed it, described as quite complete. Cecily had not planned this. She had not been, as some people would later suggest, executing a long con from the beginning of her marriage. She had simply at every turn made the careful choice instead of the careless one. She had paid attention when Rowan had not. She had read the documents when they were placed in front of her. She had kept records because she was the kind of person who kept records, not because she had anticipated needing them. The distinction mattered to her. She wanted to be clear about it, later, when she tried to explain it to people she trusted. She had not been planning to leave. She had been building a life that was genuinely hers, in the quiet spaces that Rowan had never thought to occupy, because she had understood at some point not all at once, but slowly, the way understanding arrives when you give it time, that she could not put her whole self inside a marriage and have it be enough. What she had found in those quiet spaces was not revenge. It was herself. The story might have stayed private. Two people, a difficult ending, the ordinary grief of a marriage dissolving. Except that 2 months after Cecily left, the Atlantic Children's Foundation announced its largest single funding commitment in its 30-year history. The announcement was made at a Thursday morning press event in the Foundation's downtown offices. The chair of the board, a woman named Ingrid Forsyth, whom Cecily had worked alongside for 5 years, stood at the podium and described a new endowed fund for early childhood programs across Atlantic Canada, to be established through an 8-year commitment from a private donor who had requested that her name not be attached to the fund's title. The fund was to be called the Judith Folds Early Learning Initiative. Cecily had not publicized this. She had no interest in publicity. She had, in fact, specifically instructed Ingrid to avoid any reference to her connection to the fund beyond what was legally required in the disclosure documentation. Ingrid had agreed and had then, with the careful indirection of someone who has known a person for a long time, ensured that the journalists in attendance had access to the disclosure documentation. The story ran in the Chronicle Herald the following morning. Rowan read it at his desk. He sat for a long time without moving. He had known, in an abstract way, that Cecily had volunteered a great deal of time with the Foundation. He had known she was organized and effective and well regarded. He had not known, because he had not asked, because it had not occurred to him to ask, anything about what she actually did with her time, her energy, her capabilities, the parts of herself she had been bringing to that work for years while he was in Montreal, telling himself his marriage was fine. He thought about the note she had left on the kitchen island. Don't look for me until you've been honest with yourself about what you were hoping I would be. He had not, until that morning, fully understood it. He understood it now. He called her once more, a week after the Chronicle Herald story ran. She answered. He said he wanted to talk. She said she was available on Thursday afternoon if he wanted to come to her solicitor's office. He said he didn't mean about logistics. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said evenly, I know what you mean, Rowan, but I think we should start with logistics. They met at the solicitor's office on a Thursday. That was, as it happened, sunny. One of those sharp, clear Halifax days in late autumn when the light comes off the harbor, at an angle that makes everything look briefly like it met. Rowan sat across from her at a long table, and she looked the way she always looked, composed, present, slightly out of reach, in a way he had never registered before as meaningful. He apologized. He said the things that people say in these moments, that he had been foolish, that he had taken her for granted, that he had not understood what he had. She listened. She did not fill his pauses for him, which was unusual. She had, for years, been the person who completed his sentences, smoothed his transitions, made the conversation easier. She did not do that now. When he finished, she said, I believe you. I also think the version of me you want back is the one who would accept this and make it easier for you to feel better. I'm not her anymore. I'm not sure I ever really was. He asked if there was anything that would change her mind. She thought about it, honestly. He could see her thinking, see her giving the question the same care. She gave everything. And then she said, No, I don't think so. But I don't want you to take that as a verdict on you as a person. I think you'll be fine, Rowan. I think you'll figure out what you should have figured out a long time ago. I just won't be here while you do. He had driven home in the particular silence of a man who has heard something true and has no counter-argument. In the months that followed, Cecily moved into a rented apartment in the north end of Halifax. In a building she liked for no better reason than that it had large windows, and was 3 blocks from a very good bakery. She went to work every morning at the organization in Dartmouth. She had lunch with Marguerite on Fridays. She called her aunt in Lunenburg every Sunday evening, which she had done since her mother died. She spent a long weekend in Quebec City in the new year with 2 women she had met through the foundation, and she ate extraordinarily well, and walked until her feet hurt and slept better than she had in years. She was not performing happiness. She was not performing anything. She was simply, for the first time in longer than she wanted to calculate, living the size of her actual life. There were hard days, there were mornings when she woke at 3 a.m. with the particular grief of a thing that has ended. Not the grief for Rowan, specifically, but the grief for the years she had spent making herself smaller to fit inside something that had never been large enough for her. She did not try to rush through those mornings. She made tea and sat with the feeling until it passed, because she had learned, the way you learn things by surviving them, that feelings pass when you stop fighting them. The Foundation's initiative was, by the following spring, already changing things in ways she could see. New programs in Fredericton and Moncton, a pilot project in rural PEI. A partnership with a university in Cape Breton that one of her colleagues sent her a photo of on a Wednesday afternoon, that she kept returning to on her phone when she needed to remember what the work was for. Her name remained off the fund's title. The Judith Folds Early Learning Initiative. Her mother's name on a thing that was going to outlast both of them. She thought that was exactly right. Rowan continued to run Hargrove Maritime Holdings. He ended things with Rochelle Vane, quietly and without ceremony, shortly after the Thursday meeting at the solicitor's office. He hired someone to help with the household management, and discovered, over the course of several months, that this was a more complex job than he had understood it to be. He had dinner occasionally with a colleague who was also divorced and found in these evenings a kind of useful honesty that he had not previously sought out. He was not a changed man in the dramatic sense. He was a man who had learned something about himself the hard way and was doing the slow, unglamorous work of deciding what to do with what he'd learned. He did not contact Cecily again. He respected that she had drawn a line, and he had, finally, started to understand that respecting her meant respecting the things she said even when they were inconvenient for him. He read the updates due to the Judith Initiative when they appeared in the press. He read them carefully. He thought, each time, about a woman he had been given access to for 6 years and had somehow managed to never actually meet. The divorce was finalized on a mild day in March, in a manner that was, by all accounts, efficient and fair. Cecily signed the documents and thanked her solicitor, and walked out onto Spring Garden Road, into weather that had for once decided to be kind. She stood there for a moment in the pale March sun, with her coat open, and her bag over one shoulder, and nowhere she needed to be for the next 3 hours. She walked down to the waterfront. She bought a coffee from a cart near the boardwalk, dark roast, no room for cream, exactly as she always took it, and she stood at the railing and looked out at the harbor. A container ship was moving slowly out toward the mouth, trailing a low white weight. The water was gray and cold and going on for a very long way. She thought about her mother, the way she always did near water. She thought about the maps her mother had left her, still in their acid-free sleeves in a flat archival box, in the closet of her North End apartment. She thought about the Cape Breton photo on her phone. She thought about the bakery 3 blocks from her building, which had started making a particular rye loaf on Thursdays that she had already built her Thursday mornings around. She finished her coffee. She put the cup in the recycling bin by the boardwalk entrance and buttoned her coat and started walking back toward the city. She was not starting over. She was not reinventing herself or healing or becoming or any of the other words that people reach for when they are trying to describe what it looks like when a person finally stops apologizing for taking up space. She was just walking. She was just going home.